Thanks for inviting me here, and I apologise for not being able to make it in person. I've been asked to outline some recommendations designed to address what I see as the four main problems facing civil society organisations in the EU. I imagine that you've already discussed this at length today, but I'd like to name the challenges I see to make sure that my ideas about how to solve them make sense. First, I'd say we see efforts to discredit and intimidate CSOs through smear campaigns. Second, measures that drain the capacity of CSOs away from their core work by creating disproportionate administrative burdens. Third, funding policies that don't allow CSOs to plan for the long term or concentrate on their core tasks. And fourth, the exclusion of CSOs from law and policy making. Sometimes these measures aren't deliberately geared towards stifling NGOs. It may be that governments just don't realise the collateral impact of certain policies. I think that we've seen this on some measures aimed at combating terrorist financing. But an increasing number of governments are doing more of these things on purpose. And these measures are more aimed at CSOs doing advocacy and litigation on rights, environmental and anti-corruption issues, and at organisations providing services for minorities that are being targeted by right-wing populists. I'm going to outline what I think we as CSOs need to do. First, I'm going to talk about the narrative. Second, I'll talk about what we should ask of governments who are still cooperative. And third, I'll talk about what we should do when governments aren't interested in a strong civil society. So, first, we should develop our own narrative about the value of civil society. Those who are attacking CSOs at the moment are dominating public debate about civil society. And they're using two arguments to discredit or stifle organisations. One argument is that CSOs shouldn't have a voice in the political process, either because they are not elected and so don't have legitimacy to speak for anyone, or because they act in the interests of their donors, who are usually part of the elite and foreign. A second argument relates to transparency. Governments argue that they've subjected companies to transparency requirements because they influence politicians. So the same should go for CSOs who also try to influence politicians. I think that many CSOs are falling into the trap of responding directly to these arguments. But these arguments are based on a false premise, a deliberate distortion of the true nature of CSOs. So we need to develop our own narrative. Let me attempt to sketch out what that narrative could look like. Here goes. CSOs are vital to democracy. First, we educate the public so that people can make informed choices about what leaders, laws, and policies they want to govern them. CSOs are like the media, but with more expertise on a specific issue. Second, we make sure that our leaders respect the will of the people by defending international and constitutional laws that all European governments agreed are supposed to be above partisan politics. We do that by bringing court cases or complaints at national or international level. Third, we provide a channel through which ordinary people can unite their voices to speak to their representatives. Okay, I think that's a sensible direction for the general narrative about the value of CSOs. But what about responding to some of the more specific arguments about legitimacy and transparency? Here, I think it depends a bit on what type of CSO you are. Some CSOs are clearly linked to particular constituents. For example, persons with disabilities or ethnic minorities. I think for these CSOs, it's more straightforward to answer the legitimacy argument. These CSOs can say that they're putting democracy into practice by giving a united voice to groups who tend to be underrepresented among politicians. So the only way to make sure that these groups are not excluded from the democratic process is to amplify their voice by acting through an association. But it's different for CSOs like mine that work on human rights in more of a watchdog role. The kind of argument I would use is this. Human rights NGOs speak on behalf of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. All our advocacy work is aimed at making sure that European governments stick to the legal commitments they've been making for the past 60 years to protect their peoples. The Charter has been agreed by all 28 EU governments for the benefit of the 500 million Europeans they represent. So we are just working to make sure that fundamental laws agreed across political party lines to benefit all people for all time don't get sacrificed to short-term partisan interests. So that's an idea for the narrative, for a narrative on the legitimacy question. How about the transparency issue? Now, I know that this can be a tricky situation because CSOs are often arguing that others should be more transparent. So some CSOs argue that the same transparency rules should be followed by everyone, including civil society. But the way I see it, a lot of us don't live in countries with a well-educated population, a healthy public service media, and balanced press coverage. And that means that full transparency is actually being subverted by politicians. It's gone from being a tool to empower citizens to being a tool to undermine the CSOs that are often the only actor involved in lawmaking who are trying to promote the public interest. So here's what I would suggest on the transparency narrative. Politicians are supposed to act in the interests of the public. Transparency is a tool that helps ensure politicians are not corrupted or pressured by powerful people or organizations. Companies have economic power, which means there is a risk that they can corrupt politicians with personal gifts or campaign contributions, or pressure them because of their impact on jobs and investment. There are frequent examples of when politicians have been corrupted or influenced by companies to do something that is clearly against the public interest. Because of this real risk, we need companies and politicians to be transparent about when they meet. CSOs simply don't have this kind of power. CSOs can use the power of the law if they think a government is acting illegally. They can use the power of public opinion if the public cares about a particular issue, but CSOs don't have the kind of economic power that can corrupt politicians, so they don't carry the same risks as companies. CSOs are usually the only voice that is arguing in favor of the general public interest, while politicians often follow partisan goals and companies follow commercial interests. So because of the level of risk and the different purpose of companies compared to CSOs, because they're so different, there needs to be tighter regulation of the transparency for companies than of CSOs. These are some ideas about how we can make a better narrative for CSOs. I will speak a bit more briefly about other things CSOs could do. The situation is going to be different for CSOs in countries where governments are open and listening and want to do better. Here, CSOs can suggest that governments take a number of steps. First, governments could be asked to create guidelines and give training to help civil servants improve the way they involve CSOs in law and policy making. Second, governments could help CSOs diversify their sources of funding so that they're not dependent on local and national authorities for funding in the future. You might be aware that in some countries, civil society is almost entirely supported by the government, and that's not good because there are times that CSOs have to be critical, but they're too scared. So governments could A, make sure that the system for distributing funds to CSOs is independent of central government, and B, provide CSOs with support to find large private donors, but also on how to get donations from the broader public. Third, governments could also review the way that they make grants to make sure that they give core funding and not just project funding, and to make sure that the administrative burden for reporting on how funding is spent is not too heavy. This is certainly a problem when it comes to EU funding, for example. But what about when we have countries that don't really like CSOs? Here I think we need to turn to the EU to ask for help. I'm going to outline a few things that we are pushing for with our advocacy, and for the most part, we're just suggesting that the EU copies some ideas from its own foreign policy towards civil society. First, we're suggesting that the EU should create a European endowment for democracy, but for inside the EU. I'm guessing this has already come up today in conversations. EU funding for rights work inside the EU at the moment tends to be short-term project funding to help the Commission implement EU law. We want a shift, so that it's more about helping CSOs educate the public and build support for rights, democracy, and the rule of law, and also to support litigation by NGOs. That's because we think one of the reasons far-right populism is doing so well is that the public doesn't really understand why it's bad for them to give up their rights or weaken the rule of law. Now, if you're interested in doing a bit of advocacy around asking for a new fund for NGOs, now is the time to try to influence the next 7-year EU budget. And there are some groups of CSOs already making this demand of the EU in Brussels. Second, we're suggesting that the EU should create a new legal form, a statute for a European association. This could make it easier for CSOs to collaborate across borders, but more importantly, it would address one of the problems facing CSOs, which is that governments try to drown them in administrative regulations. One solution is to create a new legal form at EU level that CSOs can register under. So this would be a legal form that regulates CSOs more proportionately. So if organizations find themselves targeted with administrative burdens by governments trying to silence them, they can just register under an alternative EU-level legal form that hasn't been designed to weigh them down. Third, we're arguing that there should be some kind of body or person at EU level who is responsible for civil society. We don't have this at the moment. This person or body should collect information about trends and incidents showing that civil society organizations are being targeted. But it should also be able to speak out and apply diplomatic pressure to help organizations. I hope that you found these ideas useful. I think that there is an opportunity to improve the situation, but we need to explain to our leaders that civil society is suffering because it's a victim of far-right populism. Most of the conversations at EU level have been about how to combat populism by monitoring and punishing governments. And this is very controversial, which means it's hard to make any progress. But we can present governments with another way to preserve our fundamental values. And that's by helping civil society, because we keep rights, democracy, and the rule of law alive. At the moment, we're losing the argument, and we're increasingly seen as an illegitimate elite trying to subvert the nation. We have to make the public and progressive political forces understand that the role we play is just as important as an independent judiciary and a free media, and that they need to help us so that we can help them. Thank you for listening.